Hello and welcome to TEDCast, the show that explores topics that are on team leaders' minds. We aim to help team engagement and development become part of your continuous improvement culture. In today's episode, I'm going to be exploring what you can do when you receive difficult feedback, whether that be through TED or through other mechanisms, and how you can deal with that in a constructive way and encourage a feedback culture which can be positive for your team. So the topic of difficult feedback is one that comes up often when I speak to team leaders around their concerns when navigating TED. Particularly when you're approaching your first TED, one of the biggest barriers to getting involved with something like this is that concern that you might get feedback that is difficult to deal with. It might be overly critical, or it might be around things which are outside of your control as a team leader and as a team. So in this session, I'm going to be exploring some of the ways that you can navigate that and turn that into productive and positive conversations with members of your team using TED. The aims of this session are around recognizing the different reactions that people can have to difficult feedback, but also to understand how active listening approaches can help you respond constructively and start to embed that constructive thinking culture across your teamwork using TED. We also want to encourage self-awareness and professional growth for both you as a team leader and for your team. When we ran our workshops on this, I asked a couple of questions to the team leaders who attended. Firstly, why is feedback important? And what they said to us were things like it helps them understand what's working and what they can improve on. Also, it helps them be aware of challenges or risks around the direction that they're taking, and it helps to improve relationships and culture within the team. To help team leaders explore this, I also asked the reverse side of that question. So if you didn't have feedback, what would be the risks if you didn't get any feedback at all? And what team leaders said to us were that it would create uncertainty around the decisions that they were making if they didn't have any feedback from their team. It would also mean that the team didn't appreciate different perspectives on challenges that they face or decisions that they're taking together. When you don't get feedback, it might mean that you're heading in the wrong direction. And even if you're heading in the right direction, you might not be fully aware of whether you are or not, or be fully confident that everybody is coming with you in that direction. It may mean that you're basing decisions on imperfect information or not understanding the full picture before you're taking a decision or taking a step with your team. So you might miss opportunities to change or improve or avoid risks or challenges further down the line. Here we have some of those suggestions. So essentially, feedback is about encouraging improvement and growth. It helps enhance performance and increase accountability across the team. It helps everybody to know different people's perspectives and different challenges of the different roles that make up your team. Feedback encourages promotion and collaboration. It helps people work together because they've got a greater understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities. But it also helps to recognise and motivate team members. With feedback, it can help us understand what's going really well, and it gives us an opportunity to celebrate those successes that we have. We're often guilty, especially in the NHS, of looking to the next challenge because we're constantly faced with a changing landscape. From one day to the next, we might not know what challenges are arising, but it's so important that we use feedback as a way to recognise the successes that we've had together. And particularly at the moment, as teams have been through lots of changes throughout the pandemic that we've had in recent years and are still going through constant changes, it can really help teams to understand how they've navigated previous changes, helping them become resilient and recognizing celebrating the successes they've had together. Feedback helps us align our work with goals and objectives, and it gives an opportunity to reset and review what those goals and objectives are. It allows us to adapt and change as situations around us change that are sometimes outside of our control. So what I also asked in our breakout sessions that we had as part of our groups are, what different types of difficult feedback might you experience as a team? And there were lots of different examples coming up from teams in different settings across our organisation. But here are some of the themes that cropped up. So firstly, it can be challenging when you have to deal with non-constructive criticism. This might be where someone points out an issue or shares an opinion without any real depth of explanation. So they might not give any alternatives or new ideas offered. And it might be something like just saying, oh, our team's really bad at this, but without any justification for that reason. Another type of challenging feedback could be when it's around external factors, because these are often things that you can't control as a team leader or as a team. So it's really hard to know what you can do with that feedback. So this can be quite difficult for a team leader when you're trying to address a situation which is sometimes the responsibility of a different department or about the wider context that you work in. These might be things like NHS-wide decisions, government policy, public perception, all things which as an individual team we can't change, we just operate within that context. Another theme that came up would be feedback that you thought had been addressed. So sometimes it can be challenging if team members are constantly getting stuck on an issue which you thought you'd overcome together. And this can be definitely a challenge when you're going through your TED report if you feel you're stuck in that cycle of addressing the same things over and again. But what it can do is give you an opportunity to call that out and think around, how do we move past this as a team? Another suggestion that came up, similar to the first one around non-constructive criticism, but this idea of unjustified criticism. So when someone is criticising something without any reason or just criticising it to undermine a way forward because they feel that another way is better. So it's really important that you encourage a culture within your team where any criticism is backed up by meaningful evidence and meaningful examples so that you can start to understand it better. And final theme that came up is it can be challenging sometimes when you receive feedback that might be contradictory. And this can happen in TED because you're surveying everyone within your team, and especially when you're in a larger team, it's likely you're going to have diverse views and opinions. And sometimes you may have someone in your team who feels communication is a great strength of your team, and someone else might feel communication is a real weakness of your team. So it can be challenging to think around, how do we deal with this, given that there are definitely conflicting ideas around what's the right thing to do and what's the right way forward for us. So in our workshops, we explore different ways that this can manifest itself within TED. So firstly, when you look at TED data, there can be sometimes challenges around understanding which are the right pieces of data for us to work on as a team. By design, we've intended TED to be something which is flexible to meet your needs. So what might be an area of focus for one team might not be for another team. So it's completely open to yourself as a team leader and your team around which areas you focus on. But where this can be a challenge sometimes is that the data that's within TED might not indicate the root cause of a problem. You might have a question with a broad spread of answers, like we see here in questions 10 and 12, or one where there's a red traffic light on the data, but it doesn't explain what that traffic light is about. So in this case, on question 20, we see this statement around we have enough resources to do the job. That doesn't tell us which resources people were thinking about when they answered that. It could be finances, it could be staffing, it could be equipment, it could be a range of things. Now, sometimes I get the challenge that this is a flaw within TED, but actually this structure is by design when we created it. The intention of TED is there to prompt constructive conversations in your team. And we recognize that some of these questions will mean different things to different teams, and sometimes even different things to different people in the same team. So the TED data is intended to prompt those conversations, to get those different views out in the open and help the team understand those different perspectives that there are throughout the team. TED data helps team members gain that appreciation of those diverse opinions that are in the group. And the goal should always be to create shared accountability, because a TED report gives you a snapshot of where you are today, but that can lead to a conversation around what that journey is going to be in the future. And when you come to repeat your TED process, what would you like to see move, and where would you like to have arrived at by maybe this time next year or in 6 months when you do your next TED report? Another area of difficult feedback in TED could be in the comments. These are often one of the most daunting factors when you're new to TED as a team leader, because you don't know what those comments are going to say. You don't know if they're going to be overly critical, or those things around feedback that you can't action yourself. Maybe it's outside of your control. So it can be easy to be quite concerned about the comments within your TED. I'm going to share some examples now of comments that have come up on TED reports in the past, and just talk you through how you might go about dealing with these sorts of comments. So the first one, our team would be much more engaged if we sorted the car parking issues out. Now, unless you're a team who works in that department, often an issue like this can be completely outside of your control. However, what I would say is this is an opportunity to acknowledge that challenge for the team, and acknowledge the way that this issue might impact on our work, or the way we feel when we come into work as part of our day. We then need to focus the conversation in TED around what is within our control. So how can we make sure that when someone comes into work in the morning, they might have had a challenge finding a car parking space, but how can we make sure they feel welcome when they come on to the ward area or into the office? How can we create that culture where people feel valued and they feel good about that situation when they come in? Next one, some members of the team are great, others are just a waste of space. Really overly critical there. And what I would do is encourage your team to acknowledge the impact that this type of feedback might have, and how it doesn't really give you that context or examples of what might be creating this culture within the team. So what I would see this type of feedback as is an opportunity to openly discuss that team culture. Recognise that although a comment in a TED report would have come from one individual, it still reflects a view of the whole team, and it's part of that puzzle that makes up the team culture. You might use some of the culture resources in TED to explore what might be contributing to this sort of culture, and what that ideal culture might be that you'd want to work towards. This next one references another team. So saying that another team are the reason that we can't move on. They don't understand how they impact us. And sometimes this might feel difficult to deal with. This might feel like something which is outside of your control because it's about another team. It's not about your own team. But this type of feedback might be an excuse to explore those relationships that you have with other teams. You might want to look at some of our TED Toolkit resources in the Working with Other Teams section. These resources help you think around what those relationships are, where those relationships are appropriate, and where perhaps they need to be improved. By focusing on your role in those relationships with other teams and what your team can do to influence those relationships, you can start to improve those relationships. You can start to maybe learn about why another team acts in the way that they do. You can also think of opportunities for raising awareness with other teams around the impacts that has on you and the way you like to work as a team and why you need to work in the particular ways that you do. Final one, and this is something which can be a concern as a team leader, that you take pride in your team, you want the team to appreciate you and value you. So when you get critical feedback around managers or the leadership, it can be really difficult to manage your emotions around what's the right thing to do. Now, what I would argue with this is an opportunity to help the team understand that relationship with managers or leaders, whether it is yourself as the team leader or whether it's senior managers that sit outside of your team, it's still an opportunity to reflect on what are we doing which contributes to that relationship. How can we improve that relationship, and how can we work with those managers or leaders or people outside of our team to ensure that we have those positive working relationships. There are always things that you can do internally to influence those external relationships. This can be challenging though, and particularly if you feel that it will be a situation where you would need support in facilitating your TED feedback to explore one of these options and explore some of these tricky conversations. This is where we can support from an OD and coaching perspective. Final category in here where TED feedback can be challenging sometimes is in your trends. So when you come to do a second or a subsequent TED, you can run a follow-up TED. And the real value in this is it shows you how far your team has come since last time you did a TED survey. Now, the majority of times from speaking to teams who've done this, I see teams moving in a positive direction against most of their metrics. But where it can be challenging sometimes is where you see downward trends. So it's important to remember that whilst the intention is to improve over time, and that's definitely the goal you'll be working towards, there will always be unforeseen factors, perhaps external influences that could cause areas of team dynamics to drop. It's important to see this as an opportunity for the team to reflect on what's changed since you last engaged with TED, and talk around, is there something that you should switch back to maybe, or maybe there's something that needs to be changed again. See it as that opportunity to learn. It's all part of your continuous improvement process, and it may help you to learn around what's not worked and be able to understand why you need to try something different. So it's still really valuable, and the repeat TED process helps to add extra value to your team conversation because you've two data sets there over a period of time, and it helps to add richness to that team conversation. So for team leaders and team members, when we react to difficult feedback, there'll be different sides of our brain suggesting different things to us. Whilst both sides and different perspectives are important, it's really important that we react not based on the first suggestions that our brain registers. There is a little bit of science that sits behind this, but essentially the left side of our brain is where we form logical and considered responses that take into account different data. It makes reasoned responses, and the drawback to this is that the left side of the brain often needs time to process all of these different factors that are going on. If you think about your TED report, when you first look at your results, you're taking in all the information that's in the TED data. You're trying to take in the comments and what those themes might be saying to you. And you're also likely taking into context what's been happening in the team, what's going on externally from the team, what's that current situation that we're dealing with. So that left side of your brain is trying to marry up all these different factors to decide on what is the logical way forward and the appropriate response to make. The right side of our brain, however, is where our emotional responses are created. This can sometimes lead to defensive behaviours, especially when we see critical feedback, as it usually invokes our innate fight or flight responses. Usually these emotional based responses are quite subjective, as they're based on how feedback makes you feel. The right side of our brain reacts much quicker than the left, and that's why our emotional response is often the first to surface. In something like TED, it's important to acknowledge these emotional responses, but also be able to differentiate these for both yourself and the team. Your emotional responses are really valuable because they influence the way that we work, especially when we are really stretched as a team, perhaps we're under pressure. It's these sorts of right side of the brain emotional responses which will often surface quickly. In something like TED, though, it's important to take the time to digest how those factors are making us feel, but also to explore how we can manage those appropriately so that they don't bubble over into things like incivility, into increased stress on people's work lives and strained relationships in the team. So it can be important to use coaching questions to help people explore the full side of their responses. So both the left side and the right side of the brain working together to decide on what's the best way forward. Questions you might want to use are things like, how might someone who's not in our team view this feedback? What might their recommendations be? That sort of question helps a team member, and it can help yourself look at the data in something like TED, look at the comments as well from an objective position. You can look at that as if you're someone recommending an approach to a team, and it helps remove you from that same emotional investment which you'll likely have when talking about your team. Another question you might want to ask is, if this was another team's results, what advice would you give to them? And can the whole team contribute to the success? So what responsibilities can everybody in the team have to make these positive changes? On a personal level, it might help to ask yourself, if I acted on my initial emotions, what would I do? And then consider, what would the opposite reaction be? And then considering both those alternatives, which would have the greater benefits for everyone in the team and for our service users. What that does is it helps give someone the time to consider different actions that could be taken, and then to think which of those actions has the greatest impact. And it might be somewhere in between those two options that you come up with. This really embodies what we try to encourage through TED by creating the time and space to listen to all those different views and reactions. Helps us to understand what options we've got and which feels like the best way forward to help the team, to help the service provision that you provide, and to help all the different stakeholders that you interact with. So some tactics that you can use to help these sorts of constructive conversations and deal with difficult feedback in your team include these points. So things like active listening, using clarifying questions, acknowledging the feedback that is there, and using reflective practice can help both you and your team deal with challenging feedback. When we think about active listening, it involves showing others that you're engaged with what they have to say. In TED, that could be through exploring a data score, maybe acknowledging a challenging comment, and recognizing different viewpoints in your team discussion. Active listening helps colleagues know that you understand their perspective and are taking it into consideration when action planning. Open-ended questions help you to explore topics in more depth. In TED, this is really useful. And we use it as part of this coaching approach where we'll demonstrate through open-ended questions that we want to understand what contributes to the data responses. Also, it helps us further explore comments which may not tell the full story. So maybe a colleague hasn't justified their points in the comments and we want to explore that more. Types of clarifying questions we might ask in TED might be, what do you feel is contributing to this factor for our team? Or how has our team changed since we last did TED? Or maybe what things influence how engaged our team feels. These types of open-ended questions mean that people responding can't just say yes or no. They have to elaborate on their views, give examples, and listen to views of others to come to the right decision. Throughout this, it's important to acknowledge the feedback that has been received. Whilst you might not personally agree with all the feedback because it differs from your own perspective, and you recognise that there are differing views throughout your team, it's important that you demonstrate that you understand different viewpoints and you understand how the situations, the culture, the context, the ways of working in your team could contribute to those different viewpoints. By doing this, you encourage others to also acknowledge contradictory views and different viewpoints throughout the team. By doing this together as a team, you can help the whole team generate shared understanding and a positive culture. And the more times you repeat the TED process, the better your team will become at giving constructive feedback, feeling comfortable, being critical of different areas of your team, but also feeling positive about taking shared ownership of those challenges that you have together as a team. The final factor in getting this right is in reflective practice. So it's important to always consider the context in which your feedback is given. For example, if you're completing TED during winter pressure season, it's reasonable to expect your team to feel that maybe your team resources are stretched or that your energy is low as a team. Also, maybe if you complete TED after a change in your service, it's reasonable to expect that participants might focus on that change when they're answering this question statement in TED. With reflective practice, you can explore these situations further and understand them better together. Many of the TED Toolkit resources help you to encourage reflective practice in your team. It's important to remember that a single TED report gives you a snapshot in time for how that team was feeling at that point. Some of the challenges we get around TED is that TED feedback doesn't feel an accurate representation of how the team feels all the time, and that's absolutely correct. But this is also why we encourage teams to repeat TED regularly. If you're doing TED every year, or perhaps even more frequently, then you can begin to build up a more balanced view of how the team generally feels, what your team culture is like, and how well you work together. And only by exploring this and revisiting it regularly, using reflective practice to reflect on the journey that you've been on together, can you become stronger as a team, improve your ways of working, and overcome challenges together. Reflective practice helps teams become more resilient because they're aware of past challenges they've been through, but they're also aware of the successes that they've had, and that can help them feel stronger when faced with future challenges or uncertainty. Having dealt with your initial reactions, it's important to consider how to then respond constructively. So remember the goals for delivering feedback. It should be around promoting understanding of the feedback, not just from your own perspective as a team leader, but also helping the whole team understand those different perspectives. Think about how you promote growth through shared learning. So use the information in TED as an opportunity and ensure that when you talk to your team about your TED results, you position it as that opportunity to improve together. Make sure you work towards a positive outcome and so that everyone can see your team is heading in the right direction. The intention with TED is around teams taking ownership of their current situations and making positive steps in the right direction. It's not to say that your challenges are going to change overnight, but by understanding them better, you can create confidence and resilience in your team and that understanding that you're heading in the right direction, so that when you next repeat the TED process, you'll be in an even better position than you are when you did your current one. Another useful way of responding to challenging feedback can be through the use of I statements. So examples of this could be by saying, I'm concerned about how my behaviour may have impacted on the team's ability to meet deadlines. By using I statements, you're making sure your response isn't challenging others, and it's making sure that others understand that you want to reflect on your own role. The hope would be this will encourage others to reflect on their own role in that team culture as well. Another example is someone saying, I feel proud of the progress we've made in this area, and I'm committed to continuing to improve. So again, the I statement helps people focus on, I'm taking this feedback on board and I'm thinking around what my part in getting this right is. Another example there, I value our working relationship and I want to ensure that we communicate effectively to achieve our shared goals. I'm feeling confused about the specific examples you mentioned, and I'd like to understand how I can address them. So it's not around pointing out challenges or what might not be good about the feedback. It's about sharing your own feelings about that feedback and being open to ideas and ways to improve. Another example here, I appreciate your honesty and I'm feeling motivated to work on the areas you've highlighted. And finally, I'm feeling defensive because I wasn't aware of the impact my actions were having on others. So this is a constructive way of acknowledging your emotions and how that feedback made you feel so that others understand the impact that feedback might have, but also showing that you're willing to learn and be part of that solution-based focused. This is what we want to aim for in our teams, a positive team culture where individuals take that personal responsibility, but collectively you take that shared responsibility for helping the team create a positive culture. You can then ask broader questions to the team to create that shared ownership. So questions like these examples are, as a team, how can we work to improve our team culture? What opportunities are there for us to improve the way we work together? How can we support each other when external factors impact our team? And if resources are stretched, how can we work together to maximize the resources we have? These are all useful questions to help us explore feedback, but also to make sure we're creating that shared accountability. It's not about saying this is someone else's responsibility. It's about acknowledging the challenge, but also about understanding the role we play and the opportunity we have to influence positively. Now, to help you in TED, we've got a range of resources. Something which is in the TED Toolkit is this example of a team-based action plan. And this is one of my particular favourites because what this one does is it encourages you to come up with team-based actions that apply to everybody in the team. But then it also breaks that down into what this means for individuals in our team so that individuals can reflect on their personal responsibility. What this also does is it gives team members that opportunity to hold each other to account, to ensure those standards are met and supported and encouraged throughout the team. It's always important to justify any actions with the reasons that lie behind it, so that when you get several months down the line and TED might be a distant memory since you last did it, team members can remember what sat behind that action, why it was important for you then, and why you want to still be working on it. So in this example, this team has identified data in their TED report or outputs of their TED discussion which influence these particular actions. In the TED Toolkit through the TED website, if you search for action plans, there are blank templates for this action plan, as well as examples like this that you can use. Other useful toolkits around feedback are our SBI feedback activity, which focuses on how you would address the situation, the behaviours, and the impact that those behaviours have. And that can be a useful structure for managing a conversation around difficult feedback. We also have a knowledge guide around giving feedback that you can use as a team leader and share with your team, as well as those action plan templates. So I hope that's been useful for you and given you some ideas around how you can deal with difficult feedback. But it's important to acknowledge that sometimes it can be a challenge. And we want to let you know that you're not on your own with this. You can get in touch with us in the TED team for technical support, whether it's around finding those toolkit resources or managing, setting up your TED survey. We've also got our MS Teams community group where you can ask questions, share ideas, and comment on resources that we provide. We'll also be providing more community catch-ups, so watch out for our calendar of events for upcoming factors or topics that might be useful for you and your team. You can get in touch with us through TED support at lthtr.nhs.uk, and you can access coaching support. So if you do get critical feedback or challenging feedback, which you're unsure around what are the right steps to take, get in touch with us and we can provide that support to help you make those best steps for both yourself and the team. Thank you for watching this episode of TEDcast. We hope that's been useful and help you to understand different approaches to dealing with difficult feedback. We hope through TED you can create a culture of constructive feedback and a culture where feedback is recognised as an opportunity and a gift to help you improve as a team. Please leave your feedback in the comments so that we can keep improving these podcasts and influence future events around the questions that matter to you most.